Some of you may have seen my recent video where I restored this amazing old drill press. It needs a stand as it can't stay on my workbench, so that's what I'm building in this video. I designed it on the computer with the style of old cast iron machinery legs in mind. I didn't pay any attention to how I could reproduce this as an actual item though. I intended to make it from steel, but having thought about it long and hard, I've decided to make it from plywood instead. Anyway, the first thing I'll do is make a template of the legs using this old piece of construction ply. I did think of ways of making it from steel, but they wouldn't have been very elegant methods with bits joined together all over the place and a lot of welding. Anyway, plywood will be more than solid enough and much easier to shape. Now that's marked out, I'll cut it out with a jigsaw and I'll get pretty close to the lines to minimise any sanding. The centre needs cutting out too, and that will be to house a cabinet with 4 drawers. I'll try and sand the inside somewhat squarish. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be pretty good for the cabinet to fit into. That's the template ready. Now I can start to cut some leg pieces from 3/4 inch plywood. Each leg section will be made up of 4 laminated pieces, which will make a fairly solid base. Now it's pretty much the same as cutting out the template, but this time I stay to the outside of the line, leaving some extra on, which will get trimmed back using a template and a flush trim bit in the router. That's one done, now for another 7. Here's the waste pieces, which I'm sure will be useful for another project another day. 4 of the leg sections need a piece cutting out. These will make a pocket for a top piece to fit into, and that will become more obvious further into the project. I'm just roughly removing the waste now, but I'll finish it with a router later on. This shows how the legs will be assembled and how the top will fit into them. Next, I'll attach the template to the first piece. I'll use screws as the project will be painted and any holes can be filled out. That's the first one done. Now I can glue on the next layer and then I'll use the first layer as the template. I put a couple of brad nails in just to stop it from moving around while I add clamps. Off camera, I got the other leg section up to the same stage. After they'd set, I unclamped them and routed the second layer flush with the first. Now I can glue on the last 2 layers, one either side. It's already feeling like a pretty hefty piece and will be a very sturdy support for the drill press. I reckon they look pretty cool. Next I'll round over the edges with a 3/4 inch round over bit, and this is what will give the legs that cast iron look. They're looking great, but there's still a couple more things need doing to them before moving on to the next part of the project. The feet need a decent chamfer, which will finish them off and prevent the edge of the legs from splitting if the stand is dragged or moved around. The last thing to do is clean up the pocket for the top piece to fit into. I'll screw down a few pieces of plywood for the router bit to follow. That's the leg sections done, so next I'll start on the cabinet and drawers, which will join the legs together. I'll rip down all the pieces I need for the cabinet, drawer sides and bottom from 12mm plywood. I'll then roughly cut them to length on the miter saw before cutting them to the final dimension on the table saw using the sliding table, and this ensures everything is square, making it easy when it comes to assemble them. I could round over the edge of this board, but instead I'll square up the corners in the leg section. It's very easy to do, laying the back of the chisel flat against the inside faces, and it only took a few minutes to do all of them. I'll do a quick dry fit to make sure it's okay. That looks good, so I'll glue and assemble the cabinet and legs together. I thought about putting the cabinet together first and then attaching it to the legs, but I reckon building it inside the legs will be easier. The second leg section was a tight fit, and it did take a couple of attempts to get it to fit on. Hammering it down wasn't doing the trick, so I had to work quick before the glue started to set and use clamps to pull it into position. I really like how that's looking and far more interesting than a square looking stand. A lot more work, but hopefully worth it. Anyway, next I'll make and fit the top piece. This is to tie it all together and add strength, but it will have a steel tray fitted to it later on. 2 laminated pieces of 3/4 inch plywood will make a super sturdy top. I rounded over 2 of the edges to fit into the recessed pockets in the leg sections. That looks like it's going to fit, so I'll glue and clamp it down. The base is pretty well done, so I'll make a start on the drawers, roughly cutting the pieces to length before trimming them down to the correct dimensions on the table saw. To find the length of the front and back pieces, I place 2 drawer slides and 2 side pieces into the opening and then measure what's left. I also cut the bottoms now and also out of 12mm plywood. I've made heaps of drawers like this for the workshop and they're quick, easy and super strong. Just glue and nail them together, it really doesn't get any easier. Now that the drawers are done, I just need to do a couple more things to the base before I can start to sand and finish it. I'll cut a chamfer in the front and back openings, but first I need to sand the edge of the cabinet flush with the legs. There was a bit of tear out there, but I had to do a final pass, so I slightly lowered it and did a climb cut to finish it, which worked much better. I did the opening on the other side off camera and then I finished all the corners with a chisel. And the last thing to do is add a back panel. I made it a tight fit so I can just glue and wedge it in place. One small area was lifting up, so I kept that down with a weight. Now it needs sanding to prepare it for paint. I want to hide and smooth out all the ridges on the plywood edges, so I'll need to build up the coats of undercoat. I'm using water-based paint, so I don't have to wait too long to recoat it. To help hide the plywood edges, I filled out the worst areas with a 2-part filler. If the edges still look like plywood underneath the finished paint, it will lose any chance of looking like a convincing cast iron stand. At close scrutiny, you'll always be able to tell, but I'm not worried about that as long as it looks good from a normal viewing distance. Before I go any further, I'll add some cast lettering, which I've done a couple of times before in recent videos. I used JB Weld and a plastic mould, which I carved the letters out by hand. I'll link the video above, and it was this project that inspired me to make the cast lettering in the first place. I left it to set for 6 hours, but I still put more undercoat on the rest of the stand where I could. That looks pretty good, but after sanding off any squeeze out, I decided I couldn't live with the wrong year, so I chiselled off the last two and I carved out a number 3. I left this one for 3 hours, which worked fine. I wasn't happy with it though, as the 3 was too big. So I carved another one and I did it again off camera. Anyway, now I'm putting on the final colour, which is similar to the drill press. I wasn't trying to match it. I just wanted something that was a few shades different, but it got closer than I thought it would be. But anyway, I'm going to go with it. If I remember correctly, I think I gave it 4 top coats. Next, I'll fit the drawer slides, which is pretty straightforward. Inside the cabinet, I cut a spacer on the table saw to make it easy to space them correctly. Now I need to make a few steel parts, and I'll start with the tray top. I'll make it from this piece of 3mm plate and add a 12 by 12mm steel rim around the outside. I'll bend the corners of the rim like on this test piece using the fly press. I'll make the rim in 2 halves and then weld it together. I'm marking out where to put the bends, and I'll do both pieces together at the same time to keep them the same. I'll set the stop on the top of the fly press to limit its travel and keep the bends consistent. It was difficult to hold onto the pieces, so I taped them together. The bigger fly press would have done this easier, but there's less clearance around it, so I chose to use this one instead, and it still managed with no worries at all. I'll just check them for square and make any adjustments before cutting them down ready to weld. Now that the rim's done, I can use that as a template for the top. I'll extend the marks and then I'll cut it out and weld it to the rim from the underneath. It doesn't look that pretty from the underneath, but it should look fine when it's installed. I'm super pleased with the top. Next, I'll make the drawer fronts from this 100 by 3mm flat bar. They just need trimming to length, and hopefully along with the top, it will add to the stand being convincing in that it's made of steel. Next, I need handles. I made this one off camera, but I need another 3, so I'll show that next. I made this jig for the fly press and it works awesome. The handles are 25 by 3mm flat bar, and I did put some grease on the corners of the dies to help the steel slide and form into shape. The best thing about this is they all come out exactly the same. I just need to trim them to length and drill some fixing holes. I'll clean everything down with methylated spirits ready for painting, and I'll do that with etch primer. I'll paint them with the same water-based paint as the plywood base, and although they're made of steel, they'll be fine once they're primed. Before I paint on the top coat, I'll drill a few holes for mounting the top and the drill press. I also drilled holes for the handles in the drawer fronts. Before I put it all together, I need some fitting screws to put the handles on. These cheap hex bolts just won't do, so I'll reshape the head by putting them on the lathe and making them into a dome. Now it's finally ready to put into position and fit the drawers and top. I'll hot glue the drawer fronts on just to position them, and then I'll bolt handles through the fronts and the drawer to hold it all together. I'm just placing the top on to take a look, and I reckon it looks awesome. I have made a pretty big error though. The top isn't quite deep enough. I changed the depth of the whole unit at the start of the project, and then I made the top from the original drawings, which I hadn't changed. Anyway, it's not noticeable at all in this position. You'd have to lean right over the back to see it, and I'm sure we can all keep it to ourselves. It's not the easiest thing to get into place, especially without scratching the paint, which I pretty well avoided. When it's all lined up with the holes that I've drilled, I'll use lag bolts to hold down the drill press, and it'll also hold down the tray in position too. I'll screw the VFD to the wall, but I definitely plan on making a vintage style control box that I mentioned in my last video. I was super pleased with the drill restoration, and now I'm even more excited about the whole setup. I love the stand and I reckon it suits the machine. Let me know what you think. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.